The morning started like any other. Soft light slipping through the curtains, birds chirping just loud enough to notice but not enough to annoy. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the strap of her dress for the 100th time, not because it needed fixing, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. Her stomach had been knotted since dawn, not from excitement but from that quiet, familiar dread she'd learned to live with over the past year. She'd said yes to the proposal in a quiet moment on a beach, just the two of them, waves lapping at their feet. It felt real then, pure even, but reality had a way of creeping in once the ring was on her finger. His family lived in a different world, not just wealthier, though they were, but one where names opened doors, where connections mattered more than credentials, and where people like her were politely tolerated but never truly welcomed. She wasn't from nowhere. She'd worked hard, built a life with her own hands, paid her way through school, climbed rungs on a ladder most people didn't even know existed, but none of that seemed to count when she walked into their home. There were no outright insults, no dramatic confrontations, just glances that lingered a second too long, compliments that felt like backhanded assessments, and conversations that always circled back to legacy, lineage, and what the family stands for. Today was the wedding, the day she'd imagined since she was a girl, though back then she hadn't pictured the weight of expectation pressing down on her chest like a stone. The venue was stunning, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens, white tents billowing in the breeze, crystal glasses catching the sunlight. Guests arrived in designer dresses and tailored suits, laughing easily, as if they belonged here. And maybe they did. She wasn't sure anymore. Her mother helped her into the final layer of the dress, smoothing the fabric with gentle hands. "You look beautiful," she whispered, eyes glistening. But there was worry in her voice too, a mother's instinct sensing her daughter's unease. "You don't have to do this if you're not sure," she'd said the night before. The bride had shaken her head. She loved him. That part was true. It was everything around him that made her feel small. Out in the garden, the ceremony began. Soft music, petals on the aisle, the scent of jasmine in the air. He waited for her under the arch, smiling with that easy confidence she'd always admired. She walked toward him, heart pounding, not from joy but from the fear that she was stepping into a life where she'd always be the outsider looking in. The vows were sweet, sincere. He meant every word. She believed that. But during the reception, as champagne flowed and toasts were made, the cracks started to show. His uncle stood to speak, charming, silver-haired, used to commanding rooms. He praised the groom, of course, calling him the pride of the family, then turned to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "And to our new addition," he said, raising his glass, "may she find her place among us." The room chuckled. Light, polite laughter, but she felt it like a slap. Find her place. As if she were a stray cat being allowed indoors. Not a woman who'd built a career, a life, a name of her own. She forced a smile, raised her glass in return, and took a sip that tasted like ash. Around her, people mingled, clinking glasses, snapping photos for social media. No one noticed how stiff her shoulders were, how her knuckles whitened around the stem of her glass. She caught a few sideways glances, some curious, some pitying, but mostly people just moved on. To them it was just another wedding, another celebration. They didn't see the quiet battle happening inside her. Later, during dinner, his cousin leaned over and asked, "So, what do you actually do?" The question wasn't malicious, just careless, the kind of thing someone asks when they assume the answer won't matter. She gave a short version, something about environmental strategy, policy work, large-scale projects. The cousin nodded vaguely, already turning to someone else. "Oh, that's nice," she said, as if she'd just said she liked knitting or gardening. It stung more than it should have. Not because she needed validation, but because she was used to being seen. At work, her word carried weight. Decisions waited on her analysis. People listened when she spoke. Here she was just the bride, a supporting character in someone else's story. She excused herself and walked toward the edge of the garden, needing air. The noise of the party faded behind her. Fireflies blinked in the dusk. For a moment, she let herself breathe. She thought about the report she'd been reviewing the night before the wedding. Dense, technical, full of data about coastal erosion and protected species. It was due back on her desk Monday morning. Real work, meaningful work, not this performance of perfection. Her husband found her there a few minutes later. "You okay?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, grateful for the warmth but careful not to let her guard down completely. "Just needed a minute," she said. He kissed her temple. "They don't know you like I do," he murmured. And maybe that was true. But love wasn't always enough to shield you from the world. Back inside, the dancing had started. Laughter rang out. Someone played a song she loved, and for a moment she let herself be pulled into it, swaying, smiling, pretending. But even in his arms she felt alone. Not because he wasn't trying, but because he couldn't see what she saw. The invisible walls already being built around her. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the staff had cleared the tables, she sat on the edge of the bed in their suite, still in her dress. He was in the bathroom, brushing his teeth, humming softly. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, hair slightly undone, makeup smudged, eyes tired. Who was she now? The woman who'd spent years mastering complex regulations, who'd testified before panels, who'd turned down lucrative offers to stay true to her principles, or just his wife. A title that came with expectations she hadn't signed up for. She thought about walking away, not from him, from this version of her life that felt like a costume. But she stayed, because she believed in what they had, because she hoped deep down that time would prove her worth, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet strength she'd always carried. She didn't know it yet. But in a few weeks, that strength would be tested in ways no one expected. A $840 million project would land on her desk. Powerful people would demand she look the other way. And for the first time, she wouldn't just be the bride in the background. She'd be the one holding the line, but that was still ahead of her. For now, she took off her shoes, folded her dress carefully over a chair, and climbed into bed beside him. Outside, the stars were bright. The world kept turning. And somewhere inside her, a quiet resolve began to grow. Not loud, not angry, but steady. Like a root pushing through stone. The honeymoon was over before it really began, not in the romantic sense, but in the way real life always finds its way back in. They'd spent 5 days on a quiet island, just the two of them, walking barefoot on warm sand, eating meals under string lights, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. Not the bride, not his wife, just her. But the moment they landed back home, the weight returned. Emails piled up. Voicemails blinked red on her phone. And waiting in her inbox was a project file labeled Azure Shores, Final Review Draft. She opened it that night after unpacking, sitting cross-legged on the floor of their new apartment, with her laptop balanced on a stack of books. The file was dense. Hundreds of pages of engineering schematics, environmental impact assessments, zoning permits, and financial projections. Azure Shores, a luxury coastal resort complex spanning over 1,200 acres, complete with private villas, a marina, golf course, and a man-made lagoon. The kind of project that made headlines, attracted billionaires, and got politicians smiling for photo ops. Estimated value, $840 million. She skimmed the executive summary. Everything looked polished, optimistic, designed to reassure investors. But her job wasn't to reassure, it was to find what others missed. She scrolled deeper, past the glossy renderings into the technical appendices. That's where the truth usually hid. By midnight, her coffee was cold and her stomach was tight. The baseline water quality report showed elevated levels of sediment runoff near a protected estuary. The marine biologist's field notes, buried on page 147, mentioned repeated sightings of nesting sea turtles in Zone C, an area now marked for dredging. Worse, the proposed stormwater drainage system bypassed federal wetland buffers by a mere 18 feet, technically outside regulated zones, but close enough to risk contamination during heavy rains. She leaned back, rubbing her temples. This wasn't just risky, it was borderline reckless. The next morning, she walked into the office like any other day, jeans, blazer, thermos of tea in hand. No one looked at her twice. She wasn't flashy. She didn't wear power suits or drop big names in meetings. But in this building, people knew when she spoke, you listened. She'd stopped a $300 million highway expansion 2 years ago, after proving it would flood a low-income neighborhood during hurricane season. Another time, she'd forced a redesign of a downtown high-rise because the original plan blocked emergency helicopter access. She didn't do it for praise. She did it because it was right. Her team gathered in the conference room mid-morning. Whiteboards covered in color-coded notes, half-empty coffee cups, the hum of the AC fighting the summer heat. They'd been working on Azure Shores for months, but this was the final go-no-go phase. The client, through layers of shell companies and legal intermediaries, was pushing hard for approval by quarter's end. "All right," she said, clicking to the first slide. "Let's talk about the red flags." She laid it out plainly. The turtle habitat, the wetland proximity, the outdated hydrology model they'd used to justify drainage placement. One of her junior analysts, a sharp kid fresh out of grad school, nodded vigorously. "I ran the updated NOAA tide projections last night. If we get a Category 2 storm, which we're due for, the runoff could dump untreated sediment straight into the estuary. We're talking fines, lawsuits, maybe even criminal negligence if protected species are harmed." Silence settled over the room. Then the team lead cleared his throat. "Look, I get it, but the client's not going to like this. They've already broken ground on the access road. And rumor has it the governor's office is personally invested in this project moving forward." She didn't flinch. "Then they'll have to deal with the consequences. Our job isn't to make them happy. It's to keep them legal." But later that afternoon, her direct supervisor called her into his office. He was a decent man, pragmatic, not cruel, but under pressure from above. He closed the door, offered her a seat, then got straight to it. "They want us to reframe the findings," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe present the risks as manageable with mitigation instead of critical violations. They're willing to fund a habitat offset program, plant some mangroves somewhere else, call it even." She stared at him. "You know that's not how it works. You can't offset a sea turtle nest with a mangrove sapling in another county. The law doesn't care about PR fixes." He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I know, but this project, it's tied to people who matter. Big donors, old families, the kind who make calls that end careers." He paused, then added quietly, "They're saying this could be a legacy-defining win for the firm." She understood what he wasn't saying. Don't be the one who sinks the ship. That evening, she sat at her desk again, the Azure Shores file open on her screen. Outside, the city buzzed, cars honking, distant sirens, the low thrum of life moving forward. She thought about her wedding, about the way his family had looked at her like she was a pleasant accessory but not a real part of the picture. And now here she was, holding a report that could unravel something they were deeply connected to. She didn't know for sure, yet, but she'd heard enough at family dinners to suspect their money was in this project somewhere. Maybe not directly, but through friends, through trusts, through the kind of quiet influence that never shows up on paper. She opened a new tab and pulled up public campaign finance records, scrolled through donor lists, cross-referenced names. It took an hour, but she found it. A foundation linked to her father-in-law had contributed $2 million to the governor's re-election campaign last year. And the governor had just announced Azure Shores as a priority economic development initiative. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just business anymore. It was personal, but she didn't let that sway her. If anything, it sharpened her focus. Because now it wasn't just about rules or regulations, it was about integrity. About proving, to herself, to them, to the world, that she wasn't someone who could be swayed by status or silenced by pressure. She spent the next 3 nights working late, double-checking every data point, calling in favors from contacts at the Environmental Protection Agency, verifying species migration patterns with a marine ecologist she'd met at a conference years ago. She compiled a new appendix, clear, factual, unemotional. No opinions. Just science. Just law. On Friday morning, she sent the updated compliance assessment to her supervisor, her team, and the legal department. Subject line, Azure Shores, critical environmental violations identified. Recommend immediate halt to construction. Within an hour, her phone rang. It was the firm's general counsel. "We need to talk," he said, voice tight. In person, she walked into his office expecting a fight. Instead, he looked tired. "You've put us in a tough spot," he admitted. "But you're right. The data's solid. If we push forward, we're liable. Not just the client, the firm too," she nodded. "Then we do the right thing," he exhaled. "It's not that simple. There are other considerations." She met his gaze. "Like what?" He hesitated. "Let's just say certain parties are very invested in this going smoothly. And they don't take kindly to obstacles." She didn't ask who. She already knew. That weekend, they had dinner with his parents. It was supposed to be casual. Grilled fish, wine on the patio, soft jazz playing in the background. But halfway through, his mother mentioned Azure Shores like it was common knowledge. "Such an exciting project," she said, sipping her Chardonnay. "Your father's been following the progress closely. They broke ground last week, did you hear?" She kept her voice even. "I heard." His father leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "It's going to put this whole region on the map. Luxury tourism, jobs, tax revenue, it's a win all around." She almost laughed. A win for whom? Not for the turtles. Not for the fishermen downstream. Not for the families who'd lose access to clean water if the estuary got polluted. But she said nothing. Just nodded, took a bite of her food, and let the conversation flow around her. Later, in the car, her husband asked, "You seemed quiet tonight." "I'm just tired," she said. And it was true. But it was more than that. She was standing at a crossroads, and she knew whichever path she chose would change everything. Back home, she sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. No laptop this time, just paper, ink, and her own thoughts. She wrote down every fact, every regulation, every potential consequence. Then at the bottom, she wrote one sentence. "If no one acts, who will?" She didn't sleep much that night, but when morning came, she knew what she had to do. Not for revenge, not to prove a point, but because some lines shouldn't be crossed even if everyone else is willing to look away. And so, with steady hands and a quiet heart, she began preparing the documentation that would eventually shut down an $840 million project, not with a shout, but with a whisper of truth no one could ignore. The call came on a Tuesday morning just after 9. She was in the office early as usual, sipping lukewarm tea and reviewing a revised stormwater management plan someone had sent over the weekend. Her desk was neat, pens in a jar, files stacked by priority. A single framed photo of her and her husband on their wedding day tucked just out of sight behind her monitor. Not for secrecy, but because this place wasn't about her personal life. It was about work, precision, responsibility. The video conference window popped up on her screen. Senior leadership, legal, external consultants. All faces she knew. All people who'd been circling the Azure Shores file like hawks for weeks. She muted her mic, took a slow breath, and clicked join. The meeting started with updates, budgets, timelines, media strategy. Then the project lead, a man with slicked back hair and a voice that always sounded like he was selling something, turned to the compliance team. "All right," he said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's hear the good news. We're clear to move forward, right?" A few people chuckled. Light, nervous laughter. She stayed silent. Her supervisor cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the latest data. There are concerns. The project lead raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Sea turtles throwing a protest." More laughter. Louder this time. She felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. This was the moment. The fork in the road, she unmuted. "Actually," she said, her voice calm but firm, "the concerns are serious. The proposed dredging zone overlaps with a federally protected sea turtle nesting area. The drainage system violates Clean Water Act Section 404 buffer requirements, and the hydrological model used to justify construction doesn't account for updated sea level rise projections from NOAA." Silence. She didn't stop. "If we proceed, we risk immediate enforcement action from the EPA, potential criminal liability under the Endangered Species Act, and civil lawsuits from environmental groups. The financial exposure could exceed $200 million in fines alone, not to mention reputational damage." The room stayed quiet for a beat too long. Then the project lead leaned back in his chair and laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Wow. Okay, so we're letting a few turtles shut down an $840 million economic engine? Come on, be realistic." She looked straight into the camera. "I am being realistic. The law is clear. The science is clear. Ignoring it won't make it go away." Someone from legal spoke up then, voice cautious. "She's not wrong. The violations are material." But the project lead waved a hand. "Everything's material until it's not. Look, we've got political backing, investor confidence, and a timeline that's already slipping. We need flexibility here, not fear." "Flexibility isn't the same as breaking the law," she said. That's when the vice president, older, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd built his career on handshakes and backroom deals, spoke for the first time. "Let's not get dramatic," he said smoothly. These are solvable issues. We'll fund a mitigation program, relocate the nests, adjust the drainage. No one's asking you to ignore your ethics, just interpret them with a little pragmatism. She almost smiled. Interpret ethics. As if integrity were a suggestion, not a standard. She didn't argue further. She'd said her piece. Now it was up to them. But as the meeting wrapped up, the VP added almost as an afterthought, "By the way, great job on the wedding photos. Your in-laws must be thrilled." Her stomach dropped. He knew, of course he knew. In their world, connections were currency, and she was suddenly very aware that she wasn't just an employee anymore. She was someone's daughter-in-law, tied to people who stood to lose millions if this project collapsed. She ended the call and sat very still for a long time. The office hummed around her, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the low murmur of conversations down the hall. But she felt miles away. That evening they had dinner with his parents again. It was supposed to be low-key, just pasta and salad, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. His mother poured wine and mentioned casually how excited everyone was about Azure Shores. "It's going to be the jewel of the coast," she said, eyes bright. "Your father's been invited to the groundbreaking ceremony next month." "Such an honor," his father nodded, cutting into his chicken. "Biggest development this region's seen in decades. Jobs, tourism, tax revenue, it's a win for everyone." She stirred her pasta, not hungry anymore. "Is it?" He looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" She chose her words carefully. "I've seen projects like this before. They look great on paper, but sometimes the costs aren't counted in the budget." His mother laughed lightly. "Oh, don't be so serious. It's all been approved. Environmental reviews, permits, the whole thing. They wouldn't move forward if there were real problems." She didn't correct her. Didn't say that approved didn't always mean right. That permits could be rushed, reviews glossed over, corners cut when enough money was on the table. Instead, she smiled and changed the subject. But that night, lying awake beside her husband, she made a decision. If the company wouldn't act, if they were willing to gamble with the environment, the law, and their own integrity, then she would go outside the system. Not recklessly, not angrily, but carefully, methodically, using every tool she'd learned over the years. She'd done whistleblower work before, years ago, on a smaller scale. She knew the protocols, encrypted channels, secure document drops, third-party legal advisors. She also knew the risks, career damage, blacklisting, even lawsuits. But she also knew this: silence was complicity. Over the next 3 days, she worked in quiet secrecy. She compiled every piece of evidence, the raw field data, internal emails showing pressure to downplay risks, the legal analysis from her firm's own counsel. She redacted anything that could identify colleagues who'd spoken in good faith. She kept it factual, clean, undeniable. Then, on a rainy Thursday night, she submitted the full disclosure to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance through their confidential whistleblower portal. She included a cover letter, no name, no contact info, just a clear, concise summary of the violations and why they mattered. She hit send and closed her laptop. Her hands didn't shake. Her heart didn't race. She just felt relief, like she'd finally exhaled after holding her breath for weeks. The next morning, she went to work like nothing had happened. But by noon, the office was buzzing. Rumors flew. Regulators had issued an emergency inquiry. Someone had leaked internal documents. The governor's office was concerned. No one pointed fingers, not yet, but she saw the glances, the hushed conversations that stopped when she walked by. Her supervisor pulled her aside in the hallway. "Did you hear?" he whispered. "EPA just froze all permits for Azure Shores. They're launching a full audit." She nodded slowly. "That's probably for the best." He studied her face, searching for something. "You didn't?" She met his eyes. "I did my job. He didn't ask for details. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he already guessed." That weekend, her husband finally asked. They were washing dishes side by side, the kitchen quiet except for the sound of running water. "Is something going on with your work?" he said. "You've been different." She paused, sponge in hand. "Just a big project. It's complicated." He turned off the faucet and faced her. "Mom mentioned Azure Shores at dinner. Said there's some kind of investigation now." She didn't lie. There is. And you're involved? She took a breath. I raised concerns. When they weren't addressed, I made sure the right people saw the facts. He was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, you could lose your job. Maybe, she said. But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time she saw something new in his eyes. Not just love, but respect. I didn't know you did work like that, he said. I've always done it, she replied. You just never asked. Later that night, she sat on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She thought about the turtles, the water, the families who lived downstream. She thought about her wedding, the whispers, the feeling of being invisible. And she realized something. She hadn't done this to prove anything to them. She'd done it because it was who she was, and that, more than any title or approval, was her real worth. Within 72 hours, everything changed. Not with a bang, not with headlines screaming her name, but with a quiet, unstoppable ripple that spread through boardrooms, government offices, and family dinner tables alike. The Environmental Protection Agency didn't just open an inquiry, they launched a full emergency audit. Federal inspectors showed up unannounced at the Azure Shores site, clipboards in hand, boots crunching on freshly graded earth. Construction halted. Equipment sat idle under gray tarps. And the investors, those polished, well-connected people who'd treated the project like a sure thing, suddenly found themselves scrambling. No one knew who had triggered it. The whistleblower report was anonymous, scrubbed clean of identifiers, routed through encrypted channels designed to protect the source. But suspicion spread like smoke in a closed room. At her office, the mood shifted from tense to surreal. Meetings were canceled. Emails came with vague subject lines like, internal review, confidential. Her supervisor avoided eye contact in the hallway. Even the coffee machine seemed quieter. She went about her days as if nothing had happened. Same routine, same calm focus. She attended project debriefs, offered technical clarifications when asked, never volunteered more than necessary. She didn't gloat, didn't flinch, just did her job because that's what she'd always done. The truth was, she hadn't blown the whistle to be a hero. She'd done it because ignoring the facts would have made her complicit, and that was a line she refused to cross. Meanwhile, the fallout grew. News outlets picked up the story, not with fanfare but with cautious curiosity. Major coastal development paused amid environmental concerns, you read one headline. Another quoted an anonymous EPA official saying the violations appear significant and potentially willful. Investors began pulling back. A major European bank froze its $120 million loan commitment. The governor's office issued a bland statement about ensuring compliance with all regulations, but canceled a planned press event at the site. At home, the atmosphere was different too. Her husband watched her more closely now, not with suspicion but with a kind of dawning awe. One evening, as they cooked dinner together, he finally asked, "Was it you?" She didn't answer right away. Stirred the sauce, checked the rice. Then she said, "Does it matter?" He thought about that. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It does, because if it was you just stood up to people who've never been told no." She turned to him, wiping her hands on a towel. "I didn't stand up to them. I just followed the rules. The same rules everyone's supposed to follow. But you're the only one who did." She didn't argue. Maybe he was right. The real test came the following Sunday. They were invited to his parents' house for brunch, a tradition they'd kept since the wedding, though lately it had felt more like an obligation than a comfort. She almost declined, but something in her said, "Don't hide." So she went. The house was as immaculate as ever, fresh flowers on the table, silverware polished, the scent of coffee and baked goods in the air, but the usual ease was gone. His father sat stiffly at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone with a furrowed brow. His mother kept glancing at her, then looking away. Halfway through scrambled eggs and sourdough toast, his father cleared his throat. "You hear about Azure Shores?" he asked, not looking up. She kept her voice neutral. "I saw the news. They're saying someone inside the firm leaked confidential documents," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "Sabotage the whole thing." She took a slow sip of orange juice. If the documents showed illegal activity, maybe it wasn't sabotage. Maybe it was accountability. He blinked, surprised by her directness. You think a few turtles are worth losing hundreds of jobs? Billions in economic growth? I think clean water and protected species are part of what makes this place worth living in, she said gently. Jobs shouldn't come at the cost of poisoning the future. His mother jumped in, voice tight. It's not that simple. These projects create opportunity. They lift communities. Not if they destroy the environment those communities depend on, she replied. And not if they break the law to do it. Silence fell over the table. Even the clink of cutlery stopped. Her husband reached under the table and squeezed her hand, just once, quick and firm. A silent, "I'm with you." Later, as they were leaving, his father pulled her aside near the front door. He didn't apologize, didn't admit fault, but his voice was softer now. "You really believe all that, don't you?" "I do," she said. He studied her for a long moment. Then, almost to himself, "Most people would have stayed quiet. Taken the bonus. Looked the other way." "Maybe," she said, "but I'm not most people." He nodded slowly, as if seeing her for the first time. Not as an outsider who'd married into the family, but as someone with her own spine, her own compass. Back in the car, her husband exhaled deeply. "That was intense," she smiled faintly. "Yeah, but necessary." Over the next week, the audit confirmed everything she'd reported. The EPA's preliminary findings were damning: willful misrepresentation of habitat data, deliberate circumvention of wetland protections, and failure to disclose known risks to regulators. The company issued a public statement not naming her, but thanking its internal compliance team for upholding the highest standards of environmental stewardship. It was corporate speak, but those who knew. Inside the industry, her reputation shifted overnight. She wasn't just a quiet strategist anymore. She was the person who'd stopped an $840 million project with facts and integrity. Recruiters started calling. Not just from rival firms, but from nonprofits, government agencies, even international organizations. One offer came with a title she'd never imagined: Director of Sustainable Infrastructure for a global development bank. Another promised full autonomy to build an ethics-first environmental review division from the ground up. She didn't say yes to any of them right away. She wanted to be sure. Wanted to choose a path that aligned with her values, not just her resume. At work, things were awkward but respectful. No one accused her outright, but the air had cleared. People treated her with a new kind of caution, not fear but respect. Even the vice president who'd joked about interpreting ethics gave her a curt nod in the hallway one morning. No words, just acknowledgement. One afternoon, her supervisor stopped by her desk. "They're offering you a promotion," he said quietly. "Head of compliance. Full authority. No oversight from the development side." She raised an eyebrow. "And if I say no?" He shrugged. "Then you walk away with your integrity intact. Either way, you win." She thought about that. For so long, she'd felt like she had to prove herself, especially to people who assumed she didn't belong. But now she realized she didn't need their approval to know her worth. It had never been about them. It had always been about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. That evening, she sat on their small balcony again, the city lights twinkling below. Her husband joined her, handing her a mug of tea. "So," he said, leaning against the railing, "what now?" She looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the sea. "Now," she said, "I decide what kind of life I want to build, not just for us, but for the world we live in." He smiled. "Whatever you choose, I've got your back," she believed him. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen. Not as a bride, not as a daughter-in-law, not as a problem to be managed, but as herself. Whole, capable, unshaken. The storm had passed, and in its wake something stronger had taken root. The project was officially canceled on a Tuesday in late spring. Not with fanfare, not with press conferences, but with a quiet email from the developer's legal team citing irreconcilable regulatory constraints. The news trickled out slowly, first in trade journals, then local papers, then national outlets picking up the story as a rare example of environmental safeguards actually working. Headlines called it a stunning reversal and a victory for accountability, though none named her. And that was fine. She never wanted credit. She just wanted the right thing to happen. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm, one that felt less like walking on eggshells and more like standing on solid ground. At work, she turned down the promotion. Not because she didn't trust herself, but because she realized she didn't want to spend her days putting out fires inside a system that still rewarded cutting corners. Instead, she accepted an offer from a nonprofit that partnered with coastal communities to design sustainable development projects, ones that didn't pit progress against protection, but wove them together. Her office would be smaller, her salary slightly less, but her impact, that would be real. Her husband watched her pack up her old desk one Friday evening, stacking books and rolling up cables. "You sure about this?" he asked, leaning in the doorway. She paused, holding a framed photo of a mangrove restoration site she'd visited years ago. "I've never been more sure of anything," he smiled. "You seem lighter." "I am," she said, "like I finally stopped pretending to be someone I'm not." At home, the shift was quieter, but just as profound. His parents didn't call as often at first. There was a distance, not cold but careful. Then one afternoon, his mother showed up unannounced with a basket of fresh bread and a hesitant smile. "I've been reading about that mangrove project you're joining," she said, setting the basket on the counter. "It sounds important." They sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time, the conversation wasn't about weddings or social circles or what the family stood for. It was about sea level rise, about how healthy wetlands protect shorelines during storms, about why some things are worth preserving even if they don't turn a profit. His mother listened, really listened, and asked thoughtful questions. No judgment, no veiled comments, just curiosity. Later, his father called, not about business, but to ask her advice on a small land investment he was considering near the coast. "I want to make sure it's done right," he said, voice uncharacteristically humble. "Would you be willing to look at the environmental assessment?" She did, and when she pointed out a potential issue with stormwater runoff, he didn't argue. He thanked her. That small exchange meant more than any apology ever could. Her husband noticed the change too. "They're different with you now," he said one night as they washed dishes. "Like they finally get it." "It's not about them getting it," she replied, handing him a rinsed plate. "It's about me not needing them to." And that was the heart of it. For so long, she'd measured her worth by how well she fit into their world, by how politely she accepted their backhanded compliments, how gracefully she swallowed their assumptions. But shutting down that $840 million project hadn't just protected an estuary or saved sea turtles. It had given her back her voice, her dignity, her sense of self. Months passed. She started her new role, traveling to small towns along the coast, meeting fishermen, teachers, local officials, people who loved their homes and wanted to protect them without sacrificing opportunity. She helped design a community-led ecotourism plan that created jobs while preserving wetlands. She testified before a state committee about updating outdated development codes. She even mentored young environmental scientists, especially women who'd been told their concerns were too idealistic. One evening, after a long day of site visits, she came home to find her husband setting the table for just the two of them. Candles, soft music, his famous lentil stew simmering on the stove. "What's the occasion?" she asked, hanging up her coat. "No occasion," he said, stirring the pot. I realized I never really asked you what you do." "Not the job title, the why." She sat down, surprised. "You want to know?" "I do," he said, turning to face her. "I thought I knew you, but after everything with Azure Shores, I realized I only knew the version of you that fit into my life, not the whole person." She looked at him, really looked, and saw sincerity in his eyes. No defensiveness. Just openness, so she told him. Not just about permits and regulations, but about the first time she'd seen a polluted river as a kid and cried. About staying up all night in grad school to finish a model that predicted flood risk for a vulnerable neighborhood. About the quiet pride she felt when a community she'd worked with opened their first solar-powered water filtration system. She told him about the fear she'd carried, of not being enough, of being dismissed, and how standing her ground on that one project had finally quieted that voice inside her. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner," he said. "But I see you now," she smiled. "Now you do." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that only comes when two people truly understand each other. Outside, the sky turned deep blue, stars beginning to blink awake. Later, as they washed up, he said, Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed quiet? She thought about it. Sometimes. But then I remember staying quiet wouldn't have changed who I am. It would have just buried her deeper. He nodded. I'm glad she's not buried anymore. She was too. Life didn't become perfect overnight. There were still hard days, tough decisions, moments of doubt. But something fundamental had shifted. She no longer apologized for taking up space. No longer softened her opinions to make others comfortable.